The fluorescent light above the payphone at the Husky station flickered every 8 seconds. Anya had been counting. She pressed her palm flat against the cold metal shelf beneath the receiver, trying to anchor herself against the dizziness that kept rolling up from her stomach in slow, nauseating waves. Her ribs ached with every breath, not a bruised ache, but the sharp, white-hot kind that made her certain something in there was cracked, the kind of pain that announced itself every single time her lungs dared to expand. She'd driven herself here in Brett's car, then Brett had taken the car back. He hadn't stopped to ask if she was okay. He had, in fact, driven away while she was still getting to her feet on the gravel shoulder of the QEW, 2 kilometers outside of Hamilton. She remembered the red taillights shrinking in the rain. She remembered the way her ribs had screamed when she'd tried to yell after him. She'd stopped yelling after that first attempt. It wasn't worth the air. The Husky station was another kilometer west. She'd walked it in the rain with one arm clamped against her torso, because walking with both arms swinging was agony. The woman behind the counter had taken one look at her soaking clothes, the blood drying brown above her eyebrow, and slid a box of Kleenex across the counter without being asked. She hadn't called anyone. She hadn't said anything either. She'd just pointed at the payphone beside the chip display. Anya had sat in one of the plastic chairs near the window for 20 minutes before she'd moved to use it. She had no wallet, no phone, no ID. The purse had been on the kitchen table when the 2 men Brett had sent walked into the apartment. She'd left without it, which had been less a choice and more a biological reflex. You do not stop for your purse when a man with a collapsed face and dead eyes grabs you by the hair. She had 73 cents in the pocket of her jeans, because she always put her transit money there, a habit from the foster years, when bags got stolen but pockets didn't. She had one number memorized, 1. She had memorized it 3 years ago, the way she memorized everything important. By writing it out longhand in her notebook, then again on a spare receipt, then again on the back of her forearm while she waited for the bus, over and over until it was simply part of her, like her SIN or her childhood library card number. She had not imagined she would ever use it. Anya fed her coins into the payphone, listening to the mechanical click as the machine accepted them. She lifted the receiver. It smelled of cigarette smoke and someone else's desperation. She dialed. It rang 4 times. She gripped the receiver until her knuckles went white. On the 5th ring, the line connected. No greeting, no voicemail prompt, just the low, pressurized silence of a man who had picked up a call he hadn't been expecting and was deciding in real time how much of his attention it deserved. Creed. She said his name because she didn't know what else to say, because she had rehearsed a dozen sentences on the walk to the payphone, and every one of them had dissolved the moment the line opened. The silence stretched for 2 full beats. Then, who's hurt? His voice was exactly as she remembered it. Not a question, a triage assessment. She had once, in a moment she'd found privately embarrassing, described that voice to her friend Marta as sounding like gravel that had been sitting in the sun for a long time, warm and rough in equal measure, the kind of voice that did not apologize for the space it occupied. Me, Anya said, my ribs. Maybe a concussion. I'm at the Husky on Barton East, the one past the cemetery, the payphone outside. Another silence, shorter. Stay where the cameras can see you. Don't talk to anyone. I'll be 40 minutes. The line went dead. Anya stood with the receiver pressed against her ear for another 3 seconds, listening to the dial tone, because it was somehow comforting. Evidence that she had actually called, that someone had actually answered. She hung up and went back to the plastic chair near the window. She counted the flicker of the fluorescent light above the payphone and waited. Creed's name was not Creed. That was the first thing she had learned 3 years ago, when she was 26 and still new enough to Hamilton that the one-way streets felt like personal affronts. He had introduced himself as Creed to the property management company that had subcontracted her bookkeeping practice, a practice that at the time was herself, 1 desk, and a second-hand spreadsheet license. He had walked into her Barton Street office on a Thursday afternoon, taken the chair across from her like he'd already measured the room and decided where everything should go, and said he needed quarterly reconciliations on 11 shell companies. He'd asked her rate and paid the first invoice in cash the same afternoon. She had not asked why. She had been 26 and desperately trying to hold her practice together and pay rent, and she had been very good at adding up numbers and not asking the questions that weren't in the column headers. She had done his books for 14 months. They were impeccable books. Not because the companies were doing anything legitimate. She understood that much more clearly now than she had then, but because Creed ran his operations with a terrifying commitment to accuracy. Every line item corresponded to something real. Every discrepancy was flagged and corrected before she could ask. He was, she had thought at the time, the most organized client she'd ever had. On the last day she'd done his reconciliations, he had shaken her hand at the door and given her a business card with nothing on it but a 10-digit number. If you ever need an honest answer at an honest hour, he had said, call it. She had not seen him since. She had, 3 months later, met Brett at a networking event. Brett was handsome and confident and had walked her back to her car in the rain. He had a friend, he'd mentioned, who was looking for a sharp bookkeeper for a construction firm. The money was good. The hours were flexible. She had thought, yes, this is a break in the luck, the kind of thing that happens sometimes when you've been grinding long enough. She understood now, with a kind of clarity that only arrives after someone has thrown you into a wall, that Brett had not been at that event by accident. The black Suburban pulled into the Husky station at 1:17 a.m., exactly 38 minutes after she'd hung up the payphone. It parked parallel to the building, which she noticed because normal people park in spots. The kind of parking that keeps the engine pointed toward the exit. The man who got out of the driver's side was not Creed. He was shorter, younger, wearing a canvas jacket, and he did a slow visual sweep of the forecourt before walking toward the station door. He passed within 3 meters of her chair. He glanced at her once, the way a person takes a photograph with their eyes, and kept walking. Creed got out of the passenger side. He looked exactly the same. That was her first, faintly irrational thought. 3 years and he looked exactly the same, which was to say, dense, still, and permanently inconvenient to whatever space he happened to occupy. He was somewhere in his mid-40s. He had the kind of face that had been handsome at one point, and had since been rearranged by time and circumstance into something that was harder to look at directly. Not because it was unpleasant, but because it asked too many questions. A scar bisected the left side of his jaw. His coat was wool and expensive and damp across the shoulders from the rain. He stopped in front of her chair and looked down at her. Anya looked up. "Concussion," he said. "Possibly," she said. "My pupils are equal, so probably not severe. Your eyebrow needs stitches." "I know." "Can you walk?" "Yes, I've been walking." He looked at her for a moment longer, in the way that she remembered, the way of a man cataloguing. Then he sat down in the chair beside her, which she hadn't anticipated. She'd expected him to simply collect her and move. The way you collect a piece of furniture you've agreed to help someone shift. "Tell me what happened," he said. "All of it." So she told him. She told him about the bookkeeping contract with Dunmore Construction, which she'd been on for 18 months, which she had done meticulously, which had begun to feel wrong in the small, specific ways that only a person who is extremely good at reading numbers would notice. The receivables that didn't correspond to any invoiced work. The payroll with names she'd called and found disconnected. The shell entities receiving transfers that cycled back through 3 intermediaries and settled in accounts she'd never been given access to audit. She told him about confronting Brett, about Brett going very still in the way that a man goes still when he is deciding what to do with information, not when he is surprised by it. She told him about the 2 men who showed up at her apartment at 10:30 that evening. Creed listened with his forearms on his knees and his eyes on the window facing the forecourt. He did not interrupt. He did not flinch. He absorbed information the way a ledger absorbs entries, completely, without judgment, line by line. When she finished, the silence lasted for about 4 seconds. "The men in your apartment," he said. "Do you know who they work for?" Dunmore Construction belongs to a numbered company that roots back to a man named Galveston, Colin Galveston. He runs freight operations out of Port Wentworth. Creed's jaw moved very slightly. "How do you know that?" "Because I'm a bookkeeper," Anya said. "I trace the money, it's what I do." He turned to look at her then, and something shifted in his expression that she couldn't entirely identify. It wasn't surprise. It was closer to what satisfaction looks like when it hasn't decided to announce itself yet. "There's a man by the far pump," he said, without looking back at the window. "Grey truck. Been sitting there for 11 minutes without getting gas." Anya didn't turn her head. "He was there when I arrived." "I know." Creed stood up. He put one hand briefly on her shoulder. It was a light touch, barely a pressure, but her entire nervous system noticed it. "Stay here." He walked toward the door. The man in the canvas jacket materialized from behind the chip display and fell into step beside him. She didn't see what happened at the grey truck. The angle was wrong. She watched the Suburban's headlights, which stayed on. She counted the seconds. She was at 61 when Creed walked back through the station door. He looked exactly the same as when he'd left. "They won't be following us," he said. "Let's go." "What did you?" "They'll be fine," he said. "They just need to make a call first." He helped her up from the chair, one hand cupping her elbow with a precision that carefully avoided putting any pressure on her left side, where the ribs were worst. It struck her that he'd already clocked exactly where she was injured, that he'd been adjusting his movements around it since he sat down. The way a person only does when they're paying the kind of attention that most people reserve for things that matter to them. She didn't know what to do with that, so she filed it away and kept moving. He put her in the back of the Suburban. The driver, she would later learn his name was Rafe, pulled out onto Barton without being told, headed east. Creed sat beside her. He produced a small first aid kit from the console and held it out. "The gauze," he said. "Press it to the cut. Keep pressure until we get there." "Where are we going?" "My place. I have a physician." "I don't need." 2 cracked ribs and a laceration in a province with a 6-hour wait at this hour, Creed said. "Or my physician, who will see you in 15 minutes and not ask for your health card." He paused. "Your call." Anya pressed the gauze to her eyebrow and said nothing. The Suburban moved through the wet Hamilton streets. Outside the window, the steel mills pushed their orange glow into the low cloud. The harbor was dark beyond the bridge. She watched it and thought, with the detached precision of her professional mind, that she was probably in shock, that she should eat something, that she had no idea what was in Brett's name in that apartment, and what could be used against her. She thought about the 18 months of records she'd maintained. Clean records, accurate records, records that could be read as evidence of laundering because they were, in fact, evidence of laundering, even though she hadn't known it at the time. "Creed," she said. "Yeah. Brett set me up, not just tonight. He put me in that job specifically. I've been cleaning their books for 1.5 years. "I know." She turned her head to look at him. The motion pulled at her ribs, and she absorbed the pain without making a sound. "You know." "I knew about Galveston's operation. I didn't know he'd pulled you into it." His voice was flat, professional, then a beat lower. "I should have." The admission surprised her more than anything that had happened that night. The house was on the mountain, Hamilton's upper city, above the escarpment, where the streets got wider and quieter, and the lots ran deep. It was not the kind of house that announced itself. Set back from the road behind a line of mature maples, it looked, from the outside, exactly like the house of a man who worked in private equity and took his privacy seriously. Dark brick, sealed windows, a 3-car garage with all the doors closed. Inside, it smelled of wood oil and something warm. Cedar, maybe, or an old building that had been heated consistently for decades. A woman in her 60s met them at the side entrance. She had the unhurried manner of someone who had answered the side door at 2 a.m. before, and held no particular feelings about it. She introduced herself as Dr. Okafor and directed Anya to a room at the end of the main hall without asking any questions that Anya didn't want to answer. Creed did not follow them in. The examination was thorough and clinical and left Anya feeling approximately like a vehicle being assessed for damage after a collision, inspected, tallied, catalogued. 2 fractured ribs, 7th and 8th, a laceration above the right eyebrow that Dr. Okafor sealed with surgical tape rather than stitches to minimize scarring, a moderate contusion along her jaw. No concussion, by the physician's assessment, though she advised monitoring through the night. Creed was in the kitchen when Anya found him afterward. He was pouring coffee, and he set a mug in front of her without asking how she took it. She drank it black anyway. She always drank it black. He had a folder on the table. She recognized the font on the cover page. She had used that exact template herself, 16 months ago, when she was setting up the quarterly structure for Dunmore. "That's my work," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "I pulled the Dunmore books 2 weeks ago," Creed said. He sat down across from her. In the kitchen light, he looked tired, not worn, not diminished, but the way a man looks when he has been carrying something for a long time and has made his peace with the weight. A scar she hadn't noticed before ran along the inside of his left forearm. "Galveston has been operating in my territory for 14 months. I've been building a picture of his structure. Your work is in the picture. You've had my records for 2 weeks. I've been aware of you for longer than that." Anya set her mug down, her ribs ached, her head ached. The coffee was very good, which seemed beside the point. "You should have called me." "I know. I could have." "I know," he said again. His voice did not shift, but there was something underneath it, something that was not quite an apology, because Creed was clearly not a man who apologized, but something that occupied the same space where an apology would have been. "I calculated it wrong. I thought you were clean enough that Galveston wouldn't move on you directly. I was wrong about the boyfriend." The boyfriend. She processed that the way she processed an unexpected debit, with the controlled precision of someone who has learned that emotional reactions belong somewhere other than the column that needs balancing. "Tell me about the boyfriend," she said. Creed looked at her steadily. "You don't want to know." "I'm a bookkeeper," Anya said. "I always want the full picture." He was quiet for a moment. Then he opened the folder to a tab near the back and slid 2 pages across the table. She read them. The first page was a communication log, text transcripts between Brett and a contact identified as GV Operations. The timestamps started 14 months ago, 3 days before the networking event where they had met. The second page was a liability transfer document. It was, in the language of criminal accounting, a scapegoating instrument signed by Brett. It designated Anya's reconciliation reports as the primary audit record for Dunmore and named her as the signatory responsible for the quarterly certifications. In the event of regulatory inquiry, the document made very clear who would be holding the file. Not Brett, not Galveston. Her. She had been the exit strategy from the day they'd met. Anya put the pages down on the table. She placed her palms flat against the surface, the way she had on the shelf beneath the payphone, looking for something solid. The coffee mug was solid. The table was solid. The kitchen was warm and quiet and smelled of cedar. He was never in debt to them, she said. It wasn't a question. No, he was on their payroll. He recruited me. Yes. And when I found the discrepancies and confronted him, he made a call and told them the auditor was getting suspicious. They sent 2 men to deliver a message and clear the scene before you could take your records anywhere. Creed's voice was even and precise, the way it had always been. He wasn't supposed to leave you on the highway. That was his own improvisation. He panicked when it got complicated, and he ran. Anya looked at the pages. She thought about the 2 years of her life she'd given to what she'd believed was a steady contract with a growing firm. The long hours of careful, accurate work, the trust she'd extended, which she had always extended reluctantly, and which had cost her, in this instance, everything it had to give. She had not cried since the highway. She didn't cry now. It wasn't that she couldn't. It was that grief, in her experience, was a luxury that required a stable floor beneath it, and right now the floor was uncertain. "Where is Brett?" she said. Creed said, "Rafe is handling it." The silence in the kitchen was very specific. Anya understood what it meant. She had understood this world in abstract for 3 years, since she'd spent 14 months watching the numbers and choosing not to ask what they corresponded to. She had understood it the way a person understands a tide table, from a safe distance, with detached professional interest. The distance had just collapsed. "Does Galveston know it was me who called you?" she said. "He will by morning." "And then?" "Then Galveston is my problem," Creed said. "He's been running operations in my territory for 14 months without an arrangement. He moved on someone who worked for me. He knows what that means." He paused. "The city will know by morning that you're under this house. No one touches you." "I didn't work for you," Anya said. "I did your books 3 years ago. That's a service contract, not a relationship." "I gave you a number," Creed said. "You used it. In my world, that's a commitment." "I didn't agree to any commitment." "You agreed when you dialed." He picked up his coffee. His hands were very steady. "What you owe me for answering is nothing. What I owe you for 14 months of clean work, and for not seeing this coming, is considerably more than one phone call." "I don't want to owe anyone anything," Anya said, with the flat certainty of someone who had learned, early and thoroughly, that debts were the most dangerous things a person could carry. Creed looked at her for a long moment. "You won't," he said. "This isn't a transaction. I'm not Galveston." Something in the steadiness of his voice made the sentence land differently than a reassurance would have. It landed like a statement of record. "I'm telling you the numbers. You're good with numbers. Work it out." She had heard things like that before, in contexts that turned out not to deserve them. But she had also spent 14 months in close professional proximity to this man's operation and had found it impeccable. Not morally, she held no illusions about the moral ledger, but in the specific sense that the books were never manipulated to harm someone on his own side. She had never found a line item that suggested a double cross. That was, she knew, a limited kind of reassurance. It was also the only kind she had access to right now. "My apartment," she said, "the physical notebooks. 18 months of handwritten reconciliations. They're in the filing cabinet in the bedroom, the one with the blue label tape." Creed took out his phone and sent a text without looking at the keyboard. "Done. I need to know what's in those books that could be used against me. I'll have them reviewed tonight. I want to review them myself." He looked at her. "You're running on adrenaline and 2 fractured ribs." "I know what's in those books better than anyone you could send," Anya said. "I wrote them. I know exactly which pages matter and which ones are background noise. Your people would take hours. I'd take 40 minutes." The silence stretched. Then Creed got up, went to the desk in the corner of the kitchen, and came back with a legal pad and a pen. He set them in front of her. "Then write it down. I'll be in the study if you need the files." He left the kitchen without waiting for her to respond. Anya pulled the legal pad toward her. She sat in the warm kitchen with her coffee and her cracked ribs and the clean, precise grief of a woman who had finally seen the full picture, and she began to write. Column A, what she knew. Column B, what could be proven. Column C, what Galveston would argue. Column D, what she needed in order to flip the liability back the right direction. She filled the first page in 20 minutes, then the second. At some point, Creed returned and refilled her coffee without a word. She did not look up from the page. "The transfers Galveston ran through the numbered company in Windsor. There are 4 of them that don't appear in my records. He ran them in the quarter before I was contracted. If those 4 exist, they establish that the structure predates my involvement entirely. They exist, Creed said. I have copies. Then I'm not the primary signatory. I'm a subcontractor with limited scope of access. The liability transfer Brett signed is unenforceable if I can prove I was never read into the full structure. She looked up. This is fixable. The exposure is fixable. Creed sat back down across from her. He looked at the legal pad. He looked at her. You built that argument in 40 minutes, he said, with 2 cracked ribs, after someone threw you into a wall. I work fast when I'm angry, Anya said, and I am very angry. That's useful. The corner of his mouth shifted. It was not quite a smile, or maybe it was, and Creed was someone who had simply forgotten how to let one finish. Angry and precise is considerably more dangerous than angry and loud. I'm not in your world, Anya said. She needed to say it. She needed it to be on the record between them. No, Creed said. He didn't argue it, and he didn't look away. But your world tried to bury you tonight, and the only number you had memorized was mine. You can draw your own conclusions. He stood and picked up both mugs to refill them. Keep writing. Outside, the first grey edge of morning was beginning to separate the escarpment from the sky. The mills were still burning, the harbour was still dark, and somewhere in this city, Colin Galveston was waking up to the news that the woman he'd planned to leave, holding his books, had made a call he hadn't put in his calculations. Anya turned to column E. She picked up the pen, pressed her palm flat against the solid surface of the table, and began to write exactly what she was going to do next.